The 19th Amendment was approved by Senate June 4, 1919. It had been 3 centuries. Starting with the suppressive brutality of the Salem witch trials in 1692, women like Alice Paul and Bridget Bishop devoted their lives to proving that women deserve the same rights as men. If it weren't for such brave pioneers, the layout to gender equality would have never been made. Women have been fighting for their rights since 1692. In 1692, Bridget Bishop had been accused of witchcraft. The reason they had been accusing witchcraft in Salem was because women had been trying to practice their individual rights, such as living differently by wearing different clothes and acting like they're associated with black magic. Over 200 women were accused during the Salem witch trials, with 20 executions, with Bishop as the first. She was accused of witchcraft on 7 different occasions. The village claimed that Bridget bewitched 5 women and were responsible for 2 different husbands' deaths. The children of her former husband stated that she was working with the devil because they had not received their desired inheritance. 1692 was not the first documented evidence of misogyny and certainly was not the last.
The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the first women's convention. The first one was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The convention was attracting a lot of attention, so they held more in different places. One was held in Rochester, New York, and one was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. They held these conventions because of the main organizers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They wanted to discuss women's rights privately. The town believed that they were doing these conventions for women to discuss their hopeless, unachievable rights. However, they were wrong. During the conventions, the women in favor had realized they could fight all the misogyny and maybe even overcome it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had met Lucretia Mott while they were both attending an anti-slavery convention. They were both frustrated when the female delegates were separated during the convention solely based on sex. In the U.S., lots of states started to slowly incorporate women having the same rights as men. In 1848, Stanton was tired of living under society's judgment, and her and Lucretia and others drafted a notice to announce a convention to discuss social and civic religious conditions of women's rights. This was Seneca Falls Convention. During the Seneca Falls Convention, they wrote Declaration of Settlements, which was based off of the Declaration of Independence. Within the Declaration of Settlements, there are 19 set abuses. This list talks about the rights women didn't possess and men did. After stating the abuses, they wrote a list of resolutions. There are 11 resolutions. One specifically was very controversial. It was Resolution 9. It was the one granting women the same political rights as men.
Basically, the purpose of the Seneca Falls Convention was to share the Declaration of Sentiments to a large audience. After they held multiple meetings, the news was nearly nationwide. After the news was spread, the leaders continued to campaign suffrage. After the Declaration of Sentiments, people were inspired by the women. One in particular that made a dent in gender equality history. Alice Paul was one of the main organizers from the Silent Sentinels. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns met in England while fighting for women's rights. There they learned protest tactics like picketing and hunger strikes. When traveled back, Burns and Paul decided to join the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Together, they ran the Silent Sentinels. The Silent Sentinels were a vast group of women who would find tactics to peacefully protest. In the summer of 1917, they decided to use the tactic of silence, hence the name. They would hold signs in front of the White House demanding the president to support suffrage. The protesters were harmless and people tolerated them in the beginning. However, as they continued, the town started to get restless. They were originally planning to participate in this silent White House protest for 18 months. The police, when grown restless, arrested the women on account of traffic obstructing. This clip was taken in 1914 during a suffrage protest. Alice Paul was sentenced to jail with other women, where she then created a hunger strike. They threatened to send Paul to an insane asylum and force feed her. This didn't stop Alice Paul's effort. Unfortunately, Alice Paul, including some other women, were placed in the Occoquan Workhouse Psychiatric Ward. Rose Winslow was one of them. One of her diary entries state, Alice Paul is in the psychopathy attic ward. She dreaded forcible feeding frightfully, and I hate to think how she must be feeling. I had a nervous time of it, gasping a long time afterward and my stomach rejecting during the process. I spent a bad, restless night, but otherwise I'm alright. The poor soul who fed me got literally besprinkled during the process. I heard myself making the most hideous noises. One feels so forsaken when one lies prone and people shove a pipe down one's stomach. Winslow ended the entry with the words, "All the officers know we are making this hunger strike, that women fighting for liberty may be considered political prisoners. We have told them, God knows we don't want other women to have to ever do this again." However, on November 14th, 1917, the Night of Terror struck. It was a dreadful night where the owner of the workhouse ordered the guards to beat the women into submission. This night is known to be a very dark experience for the suffragettes. 33 of them were brutally beaten and tortured, including Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. During the beating, 40 men attacked 33 women with clubs, as well as hit, punched, kicked, dragged, and choked all of the women out. Many women were injured, some fatal. By this time, the public had been protesting to get the women let out, but weren't aware of such abuse they were enduring in the jail. When the sentinels outside of jail found out, they knew they had to do something. They went to an ally that they had met at previous meetings and protests. Fortunately, he passed the letters from his lover that was stuck in the jailhouse to a newsletter. When the news went released, the public was furious. Immediate guilt rose upon society as they called for the women to be released for being wrongly tortured. They demanded support towards suffrage. The press and media wanted suffrage. The women were released November 27th and 28th of 1917. Once released, they talked widely about their experience. They went back to constant protests. After hearing the devastating tragedy that the women went through, everyone went to the president, demanding that he take some sort of action. With all the public pressing him for it, he declared that women's suffrage was urgently needed as a war measure. In the next year, Senate passed the suffrage amendment. It took time, but the 19th Amendment, stating the right of citizens of the United States to vote, shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of sex. It doesn't stop there.
The opposing side consisted of many women. In fact, a woman named Josephine Jewel Dodge, she was a large component for the suffragists. She released propaganda and made posters, and so forth. However, they didn't weigh down the suffragists. They were unstoppable. The Equal Rights Amendment was written by Alice Paul, an activist. After getting the suffrage amendment successfully in office, she drafted the ERA. 3 years later, the ERA was the second step after the 19th Amendment. The ERA was supposed to grant both genders the same legal rights. The text of the very amendment stated, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of sex," also stating that Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provision of this article. After it was introduced in 1923 and approved by Senate 49 years later, then it got submitted for ratification, but due to an 8-year deadline, the law was not legalized. It was lastly ratified by Virginia, the 38th state in 2020. The amendment was actually able to be legalized a year into its deadline because 30 states have ratified it. This wasn't possible because of the anti-suffrage efforts to not allow the ERA to be legalized. The main thing that the anti-suffragists worried about were that women would lose the privileges they had that kept them safe. Also, most argued that the duties of a woman were too much to work by themselves, and if they'd received the same legal rights as men, life would be too difficult. For example, compulsory military service and divorce child supports. ERA advocates, however, thought issues that discuss things like job and child support should be designed for one person situation instead of a whole gender. The deadline was over without full ratification. The ERA went quiet. The opposite campaign, called Stop ERA, had convinced the states that the ERA would have bad consequences by 1982. Most advocates gave up on ERA. Nobody mentioned the Equal Rights Amendment until 2017, when Nevada was the first to ratify it since 1977. Other states shortly followed after, saying that it was overdue and about time. The Congress now is debating whether to allow and to act on the amendment now. The fight that all these women had to put up for our rights has certainly crossed a frontier. It was an evolution of gender equality, the things that these women endured to get the 19th Amendment. Next is the ERA. The ERA was written in 1923, 100 years ago, waiting upon approval and ratification because the rights that the women fought for were revolutionary and changed lives forever.